The latest data and information shows that climate change is coming upon us incredibly fast and it's accelerating every day. Climate change is the most pervasive, all-encompassing issue that we face today. The challenge for that is that it requires collaboration across many different people and many different countries on a global scale to solve. The Smithsonian Environmental Research Center is a leader in trying to instill urgent solutions today. Climate change is most urgently felt in the urban centers of coastal port cities. More than 65% of the world's human population, more than 65% of the U.S. population live in the coastal zone, right at the edge of the land and the sea. They're at that interface. Those are the hubs of our commerce. That's where our economic systems are driven. With sea levels rising, those systems are being impacted by storms, and we need to deal with this urgently. This is an intense, real-world challenge that's happening right now. The issues that are causing these challenges are at the core of our economic base. It means changing our behavior to be more effective and less impactful on the atmosphere, reducing the greenhouse gases that are causing this climate change. I believe that if we act now, we can solve these challenges. There are real-world solutions. We can convert to sustainable, renewable energy. We can convert to renewable and sustainable transportation systems. We can build the infrastructure that's necessary to be resilient. We can change commercial shipping to eliminate ballast water that introduces invasive species into our ports and bays. And we can sustain and conserve the natural ecosystems that protect us. We need innovation and cooperation and collaboration to connect them in the most effective ways across different sectors of our society and connect to everyone around the world. Here at the Smithsonian, we're bringing people together to create these solutions.
Hello, Earth optimists. I am CNN's Bill Weir, and welcome to our illustrious panel on climate change and coastal cities. We're going to talk about infrastructure and environmental justice and financing the future and invasive species and ecosystems as our buffer. So many people love the water, live on the coasts. They're economic engines that are especially vulnerable to a warming planet that is out of control and with the storms and sea level rises and all of that comes with it. So I have an amazing panel. We're going to break it up into a couple different segments, and so we can spend some time instead of the big round robins here. So for our first 18-minute segment, we're going to bring in Mr. Phil Ryan, who is a chairman of Swiss Re Americas. They are the insurance company of insurance companies, and talk about the economic implications of things getting harder on the coast. We also have the mayor of Oakland, California, Libby Schaaf, whose city right there is a beating heart of commerce and folks who are in intimate relationship with that coastal ecosystem. And Admiral Allen, you remember his name from the Deepwater Horizon spill of 10 years back, retired U.S. Coast Guard, former director of the federal response to Hurricane Katrina as well. Thank you all for being here. Let me start with Mayor Schaaf. Let's talk about first of all, how your city's doing in this pandemic, and what your worries are in terms of that as Oakland as a big shipping port.
Well, you know, Oakland is an incredibly resilient city. I would like to say that we are doing better than a lot of cities across the country, so I'm thankful for that. And let's recognize, since this is an optimism summit, that there are reasons to be optimistic. Our environment is clearly having a break as we are not driving in our cars. Air traffic is down. Our port is still certainly importing and exporting goods to feed the world and to keep some commerce moving. But we certainly are trying to find the silver linings in this horrific pandemic. Oakland has been able to lower our GHGs since 2005 by 24%. Our goal is 36% by the end of this year, and this pandemic actually, ironically, will probably help us meet that goal. But I also hope to have the opportunity to talk about how important I think race disparities and an equity lens are to our work in climate change and particularly in coastal cities. Because while we are blessed to live on this beautiful coastline, the commerce of the port creates pollutants that not only impact our climate, but impact the health of some of our most vulnerable residents who tend to live right adjacent to that port activity. And one of the lessons we've certainly learned is never underestimate the wisdom of the impacted communities themselves and to give voice to them as you design solutions to maximize our addressing climate change while we also address health disparity impacts. That is an amazing opportunity, and it's something that I'm really proud of that Oakland has done well.
Yeah. Well said. Let's bring in Phil Ryan. A little bit of a plug. I just Saturday night on CNN, we're airing my feature-length documentary called "The Road to Change," where I explore all of these issues, especially what rising seas and bigger storms will do to coastal communities. And what most people think about is the next big hurricane, but it's what happens between the storms that I don't think we talk enough about, and whether or not the baby I just had will ever be able to get a 30-year mortgage in a place like South Beach or New Orleans or on the coastlines in California. Phil, give us some insight into the financial drivers that long before the saltwater is encroaching, there might be sort of an economic tsunami that hits first.
Well, Bill, that's a pretty broad question. The role that insurance and reinsurance plays is we use our capital and our risk knowledge to price risk, put a price on risk, and develop products to allow individuals in all levels of government to be more resilient. This is a big challenge. I mean, the natural catastrophes caused $140 billion of loss in just 2019. We have been focusing on climate change as a major risk area for 30 years now, but it's been hard to measure because most of the risk drivers are dominated by urbanization, what Libby mentioned, which is people are moving to cities, and most of those cities are on the coast, times the value of the assets that exist on the coast, which have driven tremendously. So it's been hard to measure climate change. But what's so interesting is over the last couple of years, we've now been able to increasingly measure climate change, particularly around heat, drought, fire, and flood. And we're now being able to measure it around major NatCats, hurricanes, typhoons, et cetera, particularly in Japan. So what that's been able to do is to allow the industry to price risk more effectively, price in climate change, which drives zoning, where mortgages get allocated, discouraging building, influencing public policy. While at the same time, the industry has been investing its assets in an environmentally sustainable way and investing heavily in infrastructure and renewable energy. So the big picture answer to your question is capital and risk are flowing to where the sustainable and resilient opportunities are, and that will help accelerate the fight against climate change.
Do you imagine a time when it gets so bad that if somebody wants to live on a vulnerable coastline, Phil, that they're going to have to assume their own risk? Will there be places that are uncoverable?
Oh, Bill, we're already there. There are lots of places where the only insurance people rely on is what they get from FEMA, and it's really up to municipalities and public policy standpoint, to work on this. There are lots of houses being built in places that shouldn't be built, and the hurricanes in 2017, particularly the impact on Houston, showed that. So, our industry and public policy needs to come together to make it clear where people should be building and developing zoning and such laws and building codes around that.
Right. Admiral Allen, please join us on this and give us your thoughts on when it comes to long-term planning and infrastructure. What places are doing it well? What should they be doing more of when it comes to this proactive thinking for an uncertain future?
Well, thanks. Let me start by observing what Arthur C. Clarke, the author of Space Odyssey 2001, said. He said, "How inappropriate to call this planet Earth when it's quite clearly ocean. 75% of the Earth's surface is ocean. It's a global commons. It's physical to agnostic to physical borders, 95% of all the goods coming into the U.S. Come by maritime transportation. And the critical linkage is that last mile. We have multimodal ports, as the mayor knows very well. They're vital to both economic and national security from a commercial and a military standpoint. And that last mile, where vessels moor, transfer cargoes and people, are being dramatically impacted by sea level rise. Not only waterborne transportation, but surface and rail as well. There are only three basic choices, and they were kind of framed earlier in adapting to this. You can look at zoning rules, raise the land and the structures. You can reclaim land or create barriers like levees and dikes, or you can just relocate. And there are some places where we don't need to be building human-made structures anymore, as was indicated. There's no good alternative. Everything's prohibitively expensive, hundreds of millions to billions of dollars based on the specifics of the ports. And not all ports will be impacted the same, but they'll all be impacted. These changes aren't going to be reversed early, so we need to start planning now. And the more we know about the physical characteristics of the port and are able to use science and data to accurately predict the impacts of these things will allow us to make the best decision of the choices we have.
Yeah. The parallels between COVID-19 and the climate crisis, keep striking me, and how the warnings that came about ecological collapse and what that could do for disease, and the warnings of this invisible threat that's heat trapping pollution as well, need to be heeded. But we have a hard time psychologically wrapping our heads around this. Mayor Schaaf, let's talk about managed retreat. That's, if retreat is really not in the American vocabulary anyway, but how is that conversation entering into managing a city like Oakland?
Listen, I'm really proud of the Bay Area. We were the very first region in the entire country to impose a shelter in place. And data shows that there is high level of compliance with our residents. And I'll tell you, we are looking for opportunities and silver linings within this crisis. And one of my favorites has been slow streets. Because so much traffic is reduced because people aren't driving to work, we've taken this opportunity to close a number of our streets, and our total goal is 74 miles. That's 10% of the roads in our whole city. We're on track to close them to through traffic so that people can walk, bike, exercise in a socially distanced, safe manner within their neighborhoods. And people are loving this. It is giving them a little bit of joy amid this crisis. And again, it's showing us kind of joyful and community-driven ways to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions, reduce health impacts, and empower communities to actually reclaim the commons, reclaim assets like our roads that have to date been dedicated to emissions-producing cars. So that is kind of what I hope is a hopeful story. And, again, we are inspired in Oakland when we invite our community to participate in these kinds of decisions. When we're doing these slow streets, we do it based on community input and previous studies on bike routes. And a similar thing happened in Oakland, which I hope people find inspiring. I know the theme is optimism. When we put a measure on the ballot in all of our Bay Area counties, that's 7.5 million people, were asked whether or not they would tax themselves $1 a month to actually start restoring our wetlands around our bay in recognition of adapting for climate change. And this measure that was put on the ballot that gave people the agency to choose to invest or contribute to fighting climate change passed by more than 70% of the vote. Again, a whole story about you involve your community, you give them agency to sit at the table and make positive climate change decisions. They will do the right thing.
Phil, before I let you go, Mayor, thank you so much. You can drop off if you'd like. We really appreciate your time and wisdom. Keep up the good work out there. Go A's. And Phil, before I let you go as well, what message would you have for coastal civic planners heading into these uncertain times? And where do you find optimism?
Well, I think there's a lot of risk knowledge that exists in the insurance industry and in the academic world around how to analyze where your risks are and to embody that. We did a body of work following Superstorm Sandy to help the New York area really identify exactly block by block where their risks were, where they shouldn't be offering zoning permits, et cetera. You know, that information is out there. The industry has it, and we should be using it. The optimism that I have is that the younger generations and the public at large are increasingly locked onto this issue. We feel it in our business. Our investors, our employees, particularly young employees, our clients, all want us to be laser focused on this business, and that's changing where we put our efforts and where we invest our assets. Remember, insurance companies are big pools of assets, and we have to make decisions on where we allocate those. And allocating along environmental standards and to promote these kinds of things is key. And that's how I derive a fair amount of optimism.
Hey, we'll take it. We'll take it all we can get. Thank you, Phil Ryan, Chairman of Swiss Re Americas. We appreciate your time. Let's bring in two more guests. I failed to introduce at the top. Thad Allen is going to stick around, the Admiral. But let's welcome Dr. Emily Pidgeon. She's the Vice President of Ocean Science and Innovation for Conservation International. And Dr. Greg Ruiz is the Director of Marine Invasions Research at the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center to talk about the importance of the ecosystems on our coasts, in between the big urban interfaces and the ports and whatnot. Emily, mangroves are our friends. Talk about what people don't really appreciate about the particular wildlife and flora and fauna around places that most people just consider swamps or getting in the way of their boating fun.
It's true, and I think perhaps most of the country here doesn't even know what a mangrove looks like, because most of the mangroves in the US are in Florida and along the Gulf Coast there. But mangroves are these forests that live in parks and have roots. In the context of what we're talking about, they provide amazing protection for communities all around the world, all through the tropics, from the impacts of climate change, from storms, from flooding, from sea level rise. And I think in the last 10 years, we've really seen an increased awareness of transitioning from that idea of swamps as smelly, mosquito-infested coastal areas to being critical green infrastructure for protecting and providing shield for many communities, whether it be small villages in the Philippines to some of the largest cities of the world, whether it's throughout the tropics. And I think we're seeing global recognition of this now, not just by the communities that have known this for a very long time, but by governments all the way up to the UN climate discussions.
Right, Admiral Allen. Those mangroves and in the we're seeing a lot of it in the Gulf Coast there as the land is sinking as sea level rises. They're hurricane sponges, right? I mean, those, you might think you're clearing something out to create another waterside community, but and sometimes that means sort of cutting off your nose to spite your face.
That's true over the last 100 or so years with the changes made to the Mississippi River to make it more of a shipping channel and the loss of the drainage into the Delta. There's been an extraordinary loss of barrier islands, of the vegetation that maintains those barrier islands, not at all helped by the oil spill in 2010. We need to be really, really concerned about the loss of those barriers and the sustainment of the plant life that grows on them, because similar to mangroves, that is the storm barrier for the Gulf Coast and Louisiana in particular.
Yeah. Dr. Gregory Ruiz, you study something very fascinating that I hadn't really considered. I have a little cabin on a lake, a really clean, pristine lake in New Jersey. And because it's so clean, they are absolute fanatics about, if you take your boat out, how cleaning it before you put it back in, so you don't bring invasive seaweeds, from somewhere else. And you study this in the oceans, the ballast water. Explain your work on how much ballast water is carried around the world in these ships, and the harm that can cause if you're not careful.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity. My focus has been largely on invasion ecology, particularly in bays and estuaries around the world. And one of the main drivers for invasions is shipping, is trade. And I think, as we all appreciate, global trade is driven by commercial ships. They essentially create a global network, an ocean highway, if you want, that connects ports and port cities around the world. And there are about 100,000 vessels in the global fleet. And one of the unintended consequences of that movement is that they also carry marine organisms and essentially deliver them unintentionally to new ports, new coastal areas around the world when they arrive. And some subset of those, when they are released, are able to establish self-sustaining populations and become quite abundant and spread. And some of those actually have really significant impacts in terms of changing ecosystem function, fisheries dynamics, disease outbreaks, a whole range of things. And the big issue has been how to minimize the consequence of that transport. And we know that ships are a really big driver for invasion dynamics around the world. And in the U.S., just as an example, we can document about 500 non-native species that have established populations in our coastal bays and estuaries, some of which have significant effects. We see an exponential increase over time, and ships are driving that. And ships deliver organisms in two ways: on the hulls of ships, as many people, the boating community, recognize, as well as in the ballast of ships, which is water taken on by ships to maintain stability during transoceanic voyages. They take it on in one port, release it in another, and unintentionally transfer large numbers of organisms. So the U.S. receives about 100,000 vessel arrivals a year. About 100 million metric tons of water, 180 million metric tons of water is delivered from overseas arrivals alone. That's about 40,000 arrivals. That's the equivalent of about 40 billion gallons of water that in the past has been teeming with organisms. So you get the risk involved there. But one of the things that I'm quite optimistic about is that we've seen a real watershed change in the behavior of ships that result from a campaign that was launched about 30 years ago, nationally, internationally, at a whole range of different regions, that was based on the science that our group does and many other groups around the world. And fast forward, we've come a really long way. We now have most of the ships that are arriving to the U.S. managing their ballast, treating their ballast water in a way that reduces the concentration of organisms and the risk of invasions. My lab has worked very closely, as an example, with U.S. Coast Guard to develop a program to track all the vessels that come into the country and how they're managing their water. and I'm pleased to report that we've gone from essentially zero management 20 years ago to about 90% of the vessels who are discharging water have treated that in some way. So we've been able to ratchet up the protection, if you want, and reduce the risk of invasions. We're just now working with our partners in U.S. Coast Guard and state of California to evaluate the performance. So we can say that on a ship level, we see a really big effect, but the ultimate measure is have we actually flattened the curve, the number of new invasions arriving. Our data so far looks very encouraging, but it will take a while. We need more measurements, just as we appreciate now with the current pandemic. Data is key, but I'm quite optimistic about the progress that's been made. And the next wave is to tackle hull fouling. Thanks very much.
No, I'm fascinated by that. I wonder, is it, and Admiral Allen, you can jump in this as well, is it just the risk of getting caught by the Coast Guard that encourages shipping companies to do the right thing, or are they incentivized in any way? I mean, just the carbon footprint of shipping must be massive when you consider, just the physics of it. What are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, let me echo the comments. We've been working the Coast Guard, and I did prior to my retirement, has worked very, very hard on ballast water issues. And there are a couple of ways to deal with it. One is exchanging the water at sea, where there is no less of a threat to the United States. The other is using technologies, whether it's filtering or certain types of light that kill the organisms. Technology has helped us here because the technology has been evolving to allow us to come to an agreement with the private sector on how we should best manage this. And I would agree we've had a lot of progress has been made in that area. Regarding emissions, this year there's going to be a new international guideline going into effect that's going to reduce the amount of sulfur in maritime fuels that should have a very positive impact on the environment. In the past, very dirty fuels have been used out at sea, and we banned most of those near the coast of the U.S. But under international agreements done at the International Maritime Organization, we're going to see a tremendous reduction in sulfur in the maritime fuels.
Admiral, is there anything on the horizon in terms of technology where you could ever imagine a green sort of carbon neutral container ship? Is that still in fantasy phase, or how would that work if it were to?
Well, Einstein tells us through conservation of energy, you're going to expend energy somehow to move a ship through the water, but we can minimize the emissions of the footprint of those vessels by employing technology. There's also a shift from traditional fossil fuels to liquefied natural gas, which, while has a carbon footprint, is much less than sulfur fuels that are being used right now. And I think technology is showing us there is a way, and I think we need to take advantage of that moving forward.
Okay, let's bring in Dr. Pidgeon as well. We were talking about mangroves and salt marshes as well. How can people get involved in thinking about nature-based solutions to all the issues we've been discussing so far?
It's very interesting. I think we have way more options than we think about. We were just talking with the Admiral about the carbon emissions. We all have been thinking about doing offsets. So how do we all have an inherent carbon emission, the shipping industry we're just talking about. And I think these coastal wetlands, whether it be mangroves or the salt marshes that the mayor from Oakland was talking about, are actually amazing, not only at protecting us from the impacts of climate change, but also at sequestering and storing carbon. And so I think conserving and restoring those ecosystems for their carbon value, and then developing those into offsets for industries such as the shipping industry is one key way. I also like to really encourage people to go and get to know their coastal ecosystems and really begin to understand how important they are. When we work in places, in small villages, whether they be in developing countries or here in the US, I find people are very connected with how important their coastal wetlands are. If you go down to Louisiana and places, people really understand how important their natural ecosystems are for protecting them, from climate change, but I live here in the Bay Area near San Francisco, and many people have never been to see the really extensive, beautiful salt marsh that lines the San Francisco Bay, to really understand how it is the sponge that absorbs all the flooding that comes with the storms that come through here. So I think really getting going and getting to know these ecosystems and really beginning to understand how they affect you on a day-to-day basis and how they protect you, I think then makes it easier to understand issues like we've talked about the insurance industry and how that has started to think about green infrastructure in the way it works, to think about port design like they have in Oakland and really bringing back all the salt marsh there. And then really appreciating and being connected to these ecosystems in a way that links them to your well-being from a climate point of view.
Let me ask you about coral reefs. You know, you hear such dire reports about acidification. What gives you hope or optimism about that ecosystem? Dr. Pidgeon.
It's always a tough question, coral reefs, because coral reefs are really the canary in the climate change coal mine. They're the first ecosystem that is really being affected in a really dramatic way, and we're seeing this in coral reefs all around the world. But we also know that we're seeing around the world that certain coral reefs seem to be tough. They seem to be able to be resilient, and we just need to go and find them and make sure that they're well protected. And I think we're also, there's some really new and interesting technologies. You were talking about technological solutions here, really new and interesting technologies for restoring mangroves that we're seeing being developed around the world using a combination of very low tech, piles of rocks put in the right place at the right time, through to all sorts of really high-tech solutions. Just this week I was learning about 3D concrete printing specifically designed for coral reef restoration. So I think it's definitely a challenge to find optimism in coral reefs around the world. The Great Barrier Reef just was subject to a massive bleaching event that was just recorded over the last month. But I think that there are places that we see around the world that seem to be resilient to the impacts of warming and acidification. And we need to just double down and make sure they have the protection they need to survive climate change without all these other impacts. And then we need to be looking at some of these technologies for ensuring restoring these systems. And I think a lot of people don't realize that coral reefs aren't just beautiful places to go visit for those of us that have had the luxury of doing so, but they provide food in the form of fisheries for millions and millions of people around the world. And they also are part of this natural green infrastructure. They're a natural form of protection for large millions of people around the world that live on coasts. They reduce wave impacts and they reduce flooding. And so this is very important. It's not just pretty fish and wonderful corals. It's also critical infrastructure for the survival of many people around the world.
I want to thank all of our guests for their insight and wisdom. Lots of food for thought about our coastal communities. Thank you, Dr. Pidgeon, Dr. Ruiz, Admiral Allen. Happy Earth Week to all of you. I will see all the rest of you, hopefully Saturday night at 10 o'clock on CNN for The Road to Change. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the amazing Earth Optimism Summit. See you later.